Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Alex Pollock of the R Street Institute, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here to our conference on Can the European Project Survive? A most pertinent and current question with interacting political, economic, financial, and social dimensions, as we know. We must build a kind of United States of Europe, said Winston Churchill in 1946. And he added in 1950, for centuries, France and England, and latterly Germany and France have rent the world by their struggles. They have only to be united together. Such uniting together has come a truly remarkable long way since 1950. The wars between France, Germany, and England now seem unimaginable as a war between, say, the northern and southern states of the United States is indeed a world historical achievement. And yet, as we know, there are severe political stresses in the European Union. Did it simply expand too fast and too much and too far? Like, say, a conglomerate making too many expensive acquisitions? Or a store opening too many branches and outstripping its ability to manage and be successful? Would a smaller number of core countries, rather than the 28 or soon 27 member states, have been a more sensible project? Economically and financially, as we know only too well, Europe has sluggish growth, debt crises, the endless problems of Greece and big problems in Italy. On one end of the life cycle, huge and growing pension deficits, and on the other end, unemployment levels for youth, which have been called uncomfortable, but I would say at disastrous levels. 15 of the European Union countries have youth unemployment greater than 20%. In 7 of these cases, their youth unemployment is worse than that of Puerto Rico. As we all know, this European Central Bank continues to engage in massive monetary experiments to support the common euro currency for the Eurozone, but without resolving some severe internal, especially north-south strains. The 19 countries of the Eurozone certainly don't seem to be an optimal currency area, but are they even a viable one? The issuance of currency is tightly attached to sovereignty. Is the European Union an optimal political area, so to speak? So we have lots of big problems and issues to discuss, and we hope we'll get out of our panel, in addition, recommendations for what European leaders should do or not do. And we have an outstanding panel to discuss these questions. Let me introduce them in the order in which they will speak, noting that unfortunately Ashoka Modi is unable to join us today due to an injury, and we wish him a speedy recovery. Our first speaker will be Fred Bergston, Senior Fellow, Director Emeritus, and the founding director of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Fred previously was Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Treasury and also Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs and Assistant for International Economic Affairs to Henry Kissinger at the National Security Council. He's a member of the President's Advisory Committee for Trade Policy and Negotiations and has been chairman of the Competitiveness Policy Council and of the Shadow G8. Next will be Vince Reinhardt, Chief Economist for Standish Mellon Asset Management and a visiting scholar at AEI. Vince was previously director of the Federal Reserve's Division of Monetary Affairs and served as secretary and economist of the Federal Open Market Committee. He's written on economic bubbles, the securities markets, monetary policy and its efficient communication, key economic variables before and after economic shocks, and the policy mistakes leading to the 2007-9 financial meltdown. Then we'll hear from Carlo Cottarelli, who is an executive director at the IMF. Carlo has served as director of the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, providing advice in public finance to 100 economies annually. Previously was with the Research Department of the Bank of Italy and the Economic Research Department of the main Italian energy company. He's worked with many individual countries such as Russia, Turkey, Italy, and the United Kingdom, and also on the broad issues of fiscal and monetary institutions, monetary policy, and exchange rates. Our last speaker, Desmond Lachman, has been a resident fellow at AEI since 2003, focused on the global macroeconomy. Desmond's written extensively on the economic crisis, U.S. housing market, the dollar, strains in the euro area, our topic of today, and the financial crises of Greece and Puerto Rico. Previously, he was managing director and chief emerging market economist at Solomon Smith Barney and deputy director in the International Monetary Fund's Policy Development and Review Department. And he is the organizer of this excellent panel. Thank you, Desmond. Each panelist will speak for about 15 minutes, after which we'll give them a chance to react to each other's comments or to clarify ideas. After that, we'll open the floor to your questions, and we will adjourn promptly at noon. So, can the European project survive? Fred, you have the floor.
Let me first of all congratulate our friends at AEI for coming into this new building. We opened our new building across the street 15 years ago. We're delighted to welcome you to the neighborhood. We don't know if Europe's an optimal currency area, but this is the optimal think tank area. So it's a great pleasure to have you across the street with us. I must tell you, I have a soft spot in my heart for this particular building because I spent a few years at Brookings in the early 1970s, long time ago, at which time Brookings either owned or I think more likely leased this building. And the team of economists I had working for me on a big project were housed here. So I actually spent a fair amount of time in this building when it was at a different part of the think tank community, and it's thus particularly appropriate for AEI to have made this its new home, and we're delighted that you're here, and particularly that it's so close for us to come to meetings here when we're participating like today. The topic today, can the European project survive? My answer is unequivocal. Yes, it can survive. Not only it can survive, but it will survive. And I include in that the euro, as well as the broader European Union. I think there are just two basic reasons for that. One is the traditional reason, mentioned at the outset. Winston Churchill said it at the end of the Second World War, the geostrategic objective of avoiding Europe ever going back to war internally. Some people argue that is dead, that thinking that goes back now 70 years is dead. I would say not at all. As you talk to European elites, European governmental leaders, business leaders, and others, it is still very much in their mind, particularly at a time when Russia is acting up on the Eastern Front, when there's huge unrest in the Middle East that's affecting Europe directly, when the U.S., they fear, might be withdrawing a bit from its traditional support and defense for them. So the truth, as viewed by most of the European leadership, is that they need Europe more than ever. It's certainly true with Angela Merkel, Schäuble, the leadership in Germany, which is, of course, the driving force. And therefore, I would suggest the traditional arguments hold. It's true that the public may not always be as sure, and there are lots of debates, and people do tend to forget. But to repeat, all the leadership groups, the elites in virtually all of the European countries, continue to take that traditional view, and that alone, I think, would be enough to assure that the European project would survive. However, there is a second reason, which in a way is even more compelling and more persuasive, at least in the short run. And that is how the European Union, and particularly the euro, is of overwhelming importance to Germany. Germany, remember, is the driving force of Europe. It's roughly a third of the economy. It's certainly the paymaster. It's certainly the dominant political force within Europe. Part of Germany's fealty to the European project is the geopolitical one. Germany, above all, doesn't want to be thrust into the position of being independent, not being part of Europe, having to exercise weight on its own outside the cooperative councils of the European Union. But Germany's economic interest is at least as important in the thinking of the German leadership. Remember that Germany is one of the most successful economies in the world. In fact, as the Germans themselves put it, we're at the bliss point. We've got a nirvana economy, full employment, no inflation, budget surplus, huge trade surplus, wages now even rising. The German economic situation, along with the US, China, India, the bright spots in the world economy. When we talk about Europe as a whole being stagnant, we kind of forget that Germany is doing so well. Why is Germany doing so well? Germany is the world's largest trade surplus country, and it's got a weak currency. And that, my friends, is the secret of Germany's current success. Back in the old Deutschmark days, Germany would get an export-led boom going. The Deutschmark would soar. Helmut Schmidt would complain about the weak dollar, but it was the soaring Deutschmark, which then brought down, to some extent, that German surplus and its growth boom. No more. In fact, I gave a series of lectures in Germany 2 years ago, which I entitled, and he was in the audience, and I talked to him at length about it before he died, The Revenge of Helmut Schmidt. Because in a sense, that's what the euro is. It enables Germany to be the world's biggest surplus country without the currency going up. Indeed, the currency staying weak because of the weak sisters within Europe, and therefore giving the Germans an optimal situation to maintain their growth model, carry out the kind of successful economic outcome that they are now seeing. So, and again, every elite group within Germany recognizes this. The business community, the labor unions, everybody within Germany understands that the euro is absolutely central to the success of the German model. Therefore, and I say this carefully and literally, therefore, Germany will pay any price, repeat, any price, to keep Europe and the Eurozone together. Whether it's bailing out Greece to keep them from leaving, whether it's authorizing the European Central Bank to do unlimited monetary expansion to keep the economy afloat, Germany will pay any price. Now, they don't always get it exactly right. They should adjust more and pay less. They should buy more product from Italy, Greece, the deficit countries, rather than just writing them checks. And they're beginning to do it. They're beginning to have some fiscal expansion. They're beginning to adjust a bit in real terms. They need to do more of that, else the impression grows that the Eurozone is beneficial only for Germany. But I think they are beginning to do that, and in any event, they'll write the checks as necessary to keep Europe together. So, for two basic reasons, I think the European project clearly survives. As some of you know, Des and I had many debates during that period, I was quite vocally confident throughout the crisis. When it looked like the thing was going to blow up, I was quite vocally confident, fearlessly predicted the euro would hold without a breakup, without any defaults, without any exits, even Greece. And at least so far, I have been right, and I continue to be optimistic. An interesting question is why there was such a divergence of views, why so many intelligent, well-meaning, thoughtful people thought it would break up, whereas I, and admittedly a minority of at least American economists, thought it would hold. And the answer is different models. As the introduction indicated, most American economists dumped on the idea of the euro before it was ever created, continue to dump on it, try to say we told you so. Joe Stiglitz has a recent book reiterating the same arguments. It's all because they took an optimal currency area point of approach and said, this is not an optimal currency area, therefore it does not work. By contrast, I and a few others, but many in Europe, took a political economy approach, using the kind of analysis that I mentioned before, and adding that optimal currency areas can be made, they need not be born. In other words, you can endogenously develop an optimal currency area and put it in place over time, even if it did not look like that ex ante, and even if it continues to disappoint for a while along the way. Now that then obviously leads to the key point. are they doing the things necessary to create an optimal currency area that will be sustainable and will last? And that is the crucial point. And one can be pessimistic and say, well, Europe does have a slow-moving crisis. It's got slow growth, not much dynamism. You can't really see a whole lot of light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe the view is around that only Germany gains, and that leads to antipathy elsewhere. I would argue that the European economic situation is not so bad. It's high-level stagnation, a lot like Japan. It's true, it's not real dynamic. It doesn't have a lot of growth, but it's at very high levels of income. There's very little poverty. It's a very wealthy area of the world, and if it doesn't grow 3 or 4% a year, well, so what? It's done well. It's continuing to do reasonably well, and per capita incomes, personal satisfaction is pretty high. It should also be noted, however, that Europe as a group, despite all the problems, has a record high level of employment at the current time. Unemployment rates are higher than here, but the employment rate in Europe is 10 percentage points higher than in the United States. So on that very important metric, they're doing a good job of creating jobs and keeping them. Even in the short run, they're growing faster than potential. They can for a while. Wages are now rising 2 to 3% on average. They've got lots of monetary stimulus from the ECB and now some fiscal stimulus, including from Germany. Recent decisions suggest that the infamous Stability and Growth Pact is now a dead letter, since Portugal and Spain have violated and been approved for violating. Germany is itself beginning now to implement some fiscal stimulus. So I think the overall picture of the economy is not so bad. Final question, what about the institutional side? Are they developing an optimal currency area? Remember that in every one of its previous crises, of which there have been many, with pessimism frequently expressed that they won't be able to overcome them, remember that Europe has always responded with more Europe. And that's the debate this time. Will the domestic politics permit a response of more Europe? I would submit they will do it, and they will emerge from the crisis stronger. It'll take some time, but down the road, they will do it. We do know that the euro itself, the Economic and Monetary Union, the formal name, was right from the start a halfway house. No doubt about that. It was a monetary union, but without the corresponding economic union. The people who created it were fully aware of that, knew that it was a halfway house, assumed, erroneously as it turned out, that the momentum of creating the Eurozone itself would propel the completion of the entire project so that it would become a full house, not a halfway house. That did not happen. So when the crisis hit, they had to try to reform the institutions on the fly at the same time that they were responding to the crisis. So that was particularly difficult. That's what underlined all the anxiety and the pessimism that the thing would collapse. But they're doing it. They're now creating a banking union. It'll have deposit insurance across the continent, pretty much the same way we do. They are going slower, and that I think is the big shortcoming which needs to be speeded up on what they call mutualization or fiscal union, moving toward at least a significant degree of fiscal consolidation to have an area-wide macroeconomic stabilization policy. That is a crucial element for a currency area. That they need to do, are moving toward it by stealth, like when they respond with more spending to deal with the migration and refugee crisis. But they need to do that more systematically and more seriously. In the meanwhile, the European Central Bank will continue to operate as the de facto government of Europe. And I make that point deliberately because a lot of people say, well, how can you have an optimal currency area or any currency area without a government? It's a fair question. But they have one, de facto. Nobody likes to talk about it, least of all the European Central Bank likes to talk about it. But when it came time to get rid of Berlusconi in Italy, the European Central Bank did it by simply noting that they wouldn't support Italy until his political succession was assured. You hope not to have to use that too often, but in fact, the European Central Bank functions as a de facto European government. And as I said, Germany is starting to adjust in a more constructive way. wants desperately to remain part of a unified Europe so it doesn't have to govern in an explicit way. And all that, I think, adds to the likelihood that over time, Europe will make these evolutions that are necessary. It's going to be messy. It won't be pretty. There'll be lots of muddling through, 2 steps forward, 1 back, or even vice versa, as has been the case with the history of Europe. But I do think the European project will not only survive, but prevail and come out better at the end of the day. I wish I could give you a detailed blueprint for exactly how that's going to happen, but my colleagues on the panel will take care of that, and I now turn it over to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fred. Vince.
Thank you. Presentation, I guess.
You have a button to push up. Ryan, how do we do on the PowerPoint?
Okay. Disadvantage of starting out in a new building is you're starting everything. Start clicking.
Well, we'll have a little
Is this
version of
being-
the European anthem, the Ode to Joy, while we're waiting for it.
See the advantages of not using PowerPoint.
Exactly. I've heard that described as being resilient to failure. Not using
Like the Europeans.
thank you for the introduction, Alex. Thank you, Des, for organizing the panel. And you're the real reason I'm here, Des, because I have never met anyone with such a cheerful countenance at the prospect of financial collapse. And I expect him, when he speaks, envisioning a continent-wide collapse, to be absolutely giddy with excitement. But the plain fact is, I was a little nervous about the topic because it really is fraught. The issues usually discussed from hardened silos of preconceived notions. As Fred said, you either believe in the project or you don't believe in the project. And you probably believed from the beginning or you disbelieved from the beginning. And the subsequent conversation tends to be at cross purposes. But then I remembered I have a lot of experience with conversations at cross purposes because as Secretary and Economist of the FOMC, I was supposed to frame issues in a way that people who really didn't agree with each other could at least have a meaningful conversation. And you'll find somewhere in the FOMC transcripts me telling the committee, don't you realize that I work for 19 people who couldn't agree on the color of an orange? So I realized the thing to do is just to turn the analysis around by asking the question from another direction. And for that, failure is a very resonant concept, in engineering in particular. So I want to frame this as an engineering issue. How does failure happen? And one of the most productive engineering approaches to answering the question, how does failure happen, is, in failure analysis, reverse engineer. Work backwards from the assumption that the European project has failed at some future point. Then ask, what limbs of the decision tree logically have we gone down to reach that point? Now, there are advantages of reverse engineering failure. Among them are, everyone must assume failure happens, however hard that will be for you, Fred. And then trace it backwards from the up the decision tree. And since we only care about the branches that lead to failure, we don't actually have to lay out all the limbs, which is really a bush of alternative possibilities for the evolution of the European project. Believers have the opportunity that all limbs lead to a dead end somewhere. Somewhere along every conceivable branch, there's a zero probability. Non-believers have to be disciplined by identifying the positive probability paths to failure. And then they can be Holmesian, eliminate the impossible so that whatever remains, however improbable, is the truth. And along the way, as we trace up and down that path, we might identify why it hasn't already happened. So please, don't fight the scenario. We're going to talk about failure of the European project, not today or tomorrow, at some abstract point in the future. Then, I also have to admit, however, that in the sense that if the UK invokes Article 50 next year, then the European project has failed in a material way. But I also have to admit that an organization that writes into its charter a path for exit is pretty resilient, actually. And we're also going to recognize we're working on a high level of generality about the EU, not specifically the euro area. And if we do that, logically, if you think about walking back the decision tree, take as given the European project failed. If that happened, then officials had to do something. They had to admit failure. And they'd only admit failure if the system wasn't resilient to an adverse shock. And its public was dissatisfied enough with the system as to admit failure. So that gives us 4 links in the logical chain, which really then leads to 4 branches in the decision tree, the part of the decision tree we care about, and 4 key questions. Let's start from the top now. Why does the public support the European project? There are 2 possibilities, and one is it's the noble experiment that Alex basically started with the quote from Churchill. It's the European peace project. And if the consensus holds, we're done. If the people of Europe are committed to the European peace project, they will pay any price. If the consensus breaks down, however, then we have to go further down the decision tree. Alternatively, it really could be an economic reason the public supports the project. Fred gave away that secret. It, in fact, is an intricate, opaque European subsidy mechanism. And if it's a European subsidy mechanism, we logically have to ask the question, does it still have a positive net present value? And if it's an economic question, there is no such thing as paying any price. One can imagine a set of circumstances in which the project doesn't have a positive net present value. So we want to talk about that. So we only head toward failure if the consensus breaks down. It's no longer seen as furthering the European peace project, or it's no longer economically viable. It is therefore weakened and vulnerable to an adverse shock. We have to ask, are there large shocks? If there aren't any shocks, there's nothing to, or no large shocks, then we don't particularly have to worry. If there are large shocks, we then have to ask, is the system resilient? And if the system isn't resilient to a large shock that the people no longer support, we then have to ask, will the day come when someone is willing, a European official is willing to acknowledge failure? Are they willing to let the European project fail on their watch? The answer is yes. We've made our case. So let's look at these 4 key questions. In particular, why does the public support the European project? And the obvious economic one is because of the euro, Germany is not Switzerland. Germany does not have a currency value appropriate to its national attitude toward low inflation and low debt. And it is not an accident that a country with a similar national attitude to low inflation and low debt has a much more appreciated currency relative to Germany, i.e. the Swiss experience. In that sense, the European experiment is an intricate, complicated, opaque subsidy mechanism to German manufacturers who have a weaker currency than they would otherwise, and their banks provide vendor finance for that activity. And so it's central to the German economy, but It is also costly to the German economy in the extent to which are subsidizing the project to have a weaker currency. And it's also not an accident that this has been to the benefit of Germany's GDP. Just compare real per capita GDP of Switzerland and Germany, about 5% difference by the end of this year, a year associated mostly with the currency. Germany has therefore gotten this benefit from a weaker currency, but it has had to make large outright payments to facilitate that, i.e. Being part of bailout agreements, i.e. large contingent payments as well, associated, say, with the very large Target 2 imbalances in the European system of national central banks. If it's an economic decision, at some point, it will lead to failure if the discounted present value of the subsidy to German manufacturing is less than the net payments it's got to make to the rest of Europe and its contingent liabilities associated with being part of the euro area. But it might not be an economic project, it could be a social project, i.e., as in the Churchill quote, it has fostered peace on a continent that has no prior century of peace. If it's social, however, we do want to make a distinction between a cross-country peace and within-country peace. That open continent has meant large immigration flows. This is a picture of the foreign-born population by country of birth at the beginning of last year. In some nations, it is a large share. It is a large and aggregate amount. Germany is learning that resentment of borrowers to the lender can be pretty fierce. Germany is learning that open borders strain national borders and national cohesion. We had the spectacle just in this morning's newspaper of one finance minister calling a former finance minister an intellectual lightweight who lives a sermonizing, pompous, and frustrated life just a few kilometers from Brussels. The reason I quote that, other than it's a great quote, is it did take my mind off the US presidential election, at least for a minute. Open national borders are a test to the social fabric. And intra-country peace may be the cost of that cross-country peace. Now, are there adverse shocks? Seriously, does anyone need evidence that there are adverse shocks? Think of two of them. Debt. This is something that you're going to see several times in the slides to come. What I've done is take the IMF's World Economic Outlook group of advanced economies and split them up between the EU members and the non-EU members on the argument that that's probably a more homogeneous set of comparators, with the difference being, are you part of the project, are you not? And this is the cumulative distribution of their debt to nominal GDP at the end of this year in the IMF's WEO's forecast. And you should read this as a cumulative distribution in terms of horizontal slices. For 50% of the sample, for instance, non-EU economies have much lower debt relative to EU economies. Moreover, that goes up, marches up pretty far up the cumulative distribution, with the sole exception of Japan, which is the observation way out there at 240% of GDP. So debt's an issue, and the question is, debt at what interest rate? If you want a shock, think about the looming renormalization of Federal Reserve policy. We saw in December a 25 basis point increase in the federal funds rate with the promise of more to come was enough to set off 3 months of financial turmoil. According to the Federal Reserve, although we'll know more next week, Federal Reserve officials see continuing to walk down that path, continuing to walk down a path in which essentially global finance sits on a table with four legs: the Federal Reserve, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, and the People's Bank of China, and one of them will be changing materially in height. That will be a test for global finance. It will therefore be a test for the financial institutions already weakened in the European area, and for sovereigns, some of whom have particularly large stocks of debt. All right, it's possible the consensus breaks down. It's likely there will be large shocks. What about the design principle of the European Union? Will it be resilient? To that, I would just note an outcome. This is dispersion of real GDP across the EU advanced economies and the non-EU advanced economies. So just look at the 75th percentile in any given year for GDP per growth of GDP per capita relative to the 25th percentile. That's a measure of the spread of the distribution of outcomes. And in the European Union, growth is actually spreading out more relative to similarly placed advanced economies not in the European Union. They're growing apart, not together. Moreover, it's true about other outcomes too. Not just real GDP growth per capita, it's true for real GDP growth, where the dispersion in the EU is higher than in the non-EU. It's true for the unemployment rate. And it's also true, oddly enough, for inflation. Where the European Union actually has come together is in its general government budget balance. The European Union, importantly, has been a mechanism to enforce a fiscal orthodoxy across the members. Now, this dispersion may make you wonder, does this system have shock absorbers? If it doesn't have sufficient shock absorbers, it's not resilient to an adverse shock if the consensus breaks down. The last and most important question is about officialdom. Will EU officials ever admit failure on their watch? And what we've learned thus far is the answer is no. Enormous amount of resources have been spent on the project. An enormous amount of improvisation associated with keeping the project together. But there's been a feature, and what that teaches us is essentially governments in advanced economies place a Jeffersonian veneer of respect for democracy over Madisonian core of a distrust of the mob. And that's not just about Europe. Think about the budget process in the United States. Think about the Affordable Care Act that was put before the Senate by the Senate Budget Committee. And the mandate is actually enforced by the IRS. How's that a way to run a health system? Think about Dodd-Frank, which was 2,312 pages of instructions to write regulations without a guiding principle. What's happened is problem solving is increasingly elevated to undemocratic institutions. The central bank, the troika. Why? Because no one in the official class wants to put it directly to the voters. Recognize officials' anger at the UK government was about asking for a vote, not the outcome of that vote. In Europe, a fractured parliamentary system makes it easier. But basically, no one wants failure on their watch, which is why it's lasted so long. And I'll end on where the key problem with this is, if you wanted to be pessimistic about the European project, and that's the bureaucratic doom loop that we've seen over and over again. When presented with an unfortunate triggering event, officials have mainly opted for partial and opaque solutions. The fact that it's partial leaves residual weakness. The fact that it's opaque makes their citizens uneasy. Because their citizens uneasy, that even increases the residual weakness, making it more likely there's an unfortunate triggering event that leads to more and more complicated, opaque, inefficient solutions. As long as they can do this, the European project survives. One wonders at what cost.
Thank you, Vince. My answer to when the European officialdom admits failure is as soon as the Fed admits that it's failed. Carlo.
Okay, thank you very much. And first of all, thanks to the American Enterprise Institute for inviting me here. I will address the main question of this panel. Can the European project survive? And the answer, you can imagine coming from an executive director representing 4 European countries at the IMF, the answer is going to be yes. It's going to survive, it can survive, and it will survive. It is, however, a qualified yes. Let me start from clarifying that from the outset that I will talk about, by and large, the survival of the European project, including the euro area. I think the existence of a common currency is a key element of the project. So I believe, yes, the common currency area will survive as an essential part of Europe, provided certain things happen. So in a way, I'm a bit in between the two previous speakers. Fred said, essentially, there is no economic problem. Europe is doing fine. Vincent said, no, there are big problems. I say, yes, there are problems. They can be solved as long as, first of all, we recognize what the problems are. Indeed, I want to move to the next one of the questions that we received a few weeks ago during the preparation of this panel. One of the background questions was, what has gone wrong with the European economy? So we need to understand what went wrong to find a solution, to see how the solution can be shaped. It is clear that developments since 2010, including the euro area crisis of 2010-2011, have cast, in my view, doubts about the viability of the euro area as an economic project. But what exactly is the issue? Contrary to the position taken by many, I don't think that the imbalances that are behind the 2011-2012 crisis, imbalances that to some extent persist now and are just less visible now because of the action of the European Central Bank, derived by the suboptimality of Europe, of the euro area as a common currency area. So I agree on one thing with what Fred said. The model of the common currency area is not the right model. By the way, if you allow me to open a small parenthesis, some of you may actually have read Mandel's paper on optimal currency areas, in which he discussed, among other things, he did discuss the viability of a common currency in Europe. And I quote here a sentence that is included in that paper. According to my argument, the experiment should be largely unsuccessful as far as stabilization is concerned. The argument being, again, there are idiosyncratic shocks, the cycles, the economic cycles are not coordinated, and there is not enough factor mobility within the area. Now, this sentence that I just read you, for those who have not actually read the paper, it may come as a surprise that Mandel was referring this sentence not to the euro area, but to his own country, Canada. So he wrote this sentence with reference to Canada, saying that unfortunately Canada is not an optimal currency area. Probably was not therefore forecasting, anticipating the failure of the European project. It was anticipating the failure of Canada as a common currency area. Now, this is just for the history, for the record. Now, let's go back to the main issue, the nature of the European problems that we have seen over the last few years, the imbalances that have emerged. In my view, those imbalances, by and large, were not created by these idiosyncratic shock hitting one part of the area or another, as in the classical currency area, common currency area, suboptimality of currency area issue is described. They were essentially, the problems with Greece was not that it was hit by an idiosyncratic shock to its tourism industry. Spain, Portugal, they were not hit by idiosyncratic shocks. The high level of public debt in Italy was not due to an idiosyncratic shock that hit Italy. I would rather talk about these countries having suffered from idiosyncratic policies and the general overheating that followed to the decline in interest rates in the euro area as a result of the convergence of interest rates when the euro was included. So there was a decline in interest rate in the euro area. Some of these countries overheated. They did not adjust their structural policies and their fiscal policies in line with what would have been required to moderate those inflationary pressures. Their exchange rates appreciated, their unit labor cost increased much more than in other parts of the area. It was not because there were idiosyncratic shocks that affected one currency or one part of the area or another. It was a failure of policies to respond to a change in different conditions. It was economic conditions, the decline in interest rates, and the fact that simply behaviors had to change with respect to the past. You could not afford to have wage increases faster than, say, in Germany once you share the same currency. Again, there was no idiosyncratic shocks. It was just an issue of wrong policies and wrong behaviors, inertia, if you want. As a result of this, you see what many of you may have seen this chart showing unit labor costs across the euro area, a large divergence between Germany, on one side, Italy, Spain, Portugal on the other side. Unit labor cost moved in a very different way. Some countries lost competitiveness. Imbalances started building up. Fiscal policy, the same. Fiscal policy in Italy, for example, did not adjust enough. Italy started the 2007, got to the 2007 crisis with the debt to GDP ratio just below 100%, 99.8%. That was not enough to avoid the following problems. So what should have been done would have been to take the opportunity for Italy of reducing its public debt faster, benefiting from the lower interest rate. It did not. So this is the kind of problems that were created, not idiosyncratic shocks. It was not a problem of suboptimality of the common currency area as such. The implication of this is that there are imbalances that were due to those behaviors in that period. Unfortunately, we are dealing with stock imbalances. And it's difficult to undo stock imbalances. Yes, there has been a loss of competitiveness. Yes, public debt ratio have increased quite a lot. What is necessary to address the problem and to make the euro area project viable is that those imbalances are corrected. In terms of flows, this is easier to do. In terms of stocks, it's more difficult. Is it impossible? No, I don't think it's impossible. Spain is a country that is correcting its flow imbalances and its stock imbalances. It has regained competitiveness since 2010. Again, unit labor costs have declined with respect also to Germany. It's now growing at a 3% growth rate, so correction is possible. But it is necessary to have a change in behaviors and especially in economic policies. The structural reforms that are being implemented in Europe, including the labor market reform that was implemented in Italy, they go in the right direction. There is a need to continue along the same road. Will it happen? I don't want to speculate in terms of political economy analysis whether will it happen or not. What I know is that what the central bank is doing in a way is allowing this country to have some time to implement structural adjustment. Monetary policy has become much more expansionary since the end of 2014. It may be a surprise to some, but between the end of 2008 and the end of 2014, base money in Europe, I'm still one of the old guys who looks at these stupid statistics like base money. Base money in Europe increased by only 11% or between the end of 2008 and the end of 2014. In the same period, the liquidity of the system, base money, increased in quadrupled, almost quadrupled in the UK. It tripled in Japan, and if we include 2015, it also quadrupled in Japan with respect to the end of 2008. In the United States, I think the increase was about 2.5%, more than doubled. In Europe, it was 11%. Things have changed with 2015 and the new round of QEs, and I believe that since the end of 2014 and now in the first half of 2016, base money in Europe has increased by something like 55%. So the conditions are there in terms of buying time for the adjustment to take place, including by taking pressure away from governments and making public debt more sustainable for a while. The real question is whether this action by the ECB is also taking away pressure from countries to reform their policies. That's, in a way, it's a risk. I see as the main institution that leads to avoid this risk for materializing, the main institution that should do this is the Commission. So we have to rely on the Commission to make sure that in spite of the quite relaxed monetary conditions that are prevailing now in Europe and keep interest rates very low for government papers, for governments, make public debt easily financeable. In spite of this, the pressure for reform continues because it is needed if we want to undo the imbalances that I was referred earlier, which are not only flow imbalances, are stock imbalances, and I have to do to the fact that Europe, in terms of policies, in terms of economic structure, is not yet an homogeneous entity, and it needs to become a more homogeneous entity. I hope this will happen. I don't have very much to add other than hoping that this will happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlo. Desmond.
Hope is always a strategy.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Alex. I've got to say that one of my weaknesses is I do occasionally watch these singing contests in the United States, stuff like The Voice, and I feel like the judge at the end, you know, after all the other panelists have indicated that the singer was terrific and that had such great potential, it's my task to say that the singer was actually flat. Let me explain why I have got a very dim view of Europe and why I've had that for a while. The essential point is that Europe, in my view, is in a political and economic down spiral. What I mean by that is locked in the euro has produced very poor economics, especially in the European peripheral countries like Portugal, Greece, Spain, Italy. And what that poor economic performance has done is it's driven the politics. And what you're seeing in politics is that what the elites think is becoming less and less relevant. It's becoming more and more important what the people think. And what you're getting across Europe is, particularly in the peripheral countries, you're getting a fragmentation of the politics. You're getting moves towards the political extremes. You're getting difficulty in putting together coalition governments. Spain, for instance, has been without a government now for something like 9 months. And that is spreading, in fact, to places like Germany, where in the last election that they had a provincial election, a far-right party, the Alternative for Germany party, gets 20% of the vote. So it means that Mrs. Merkel's position is not as strong as it was before. And what I'm suggesting is that this is a process that they're in. They're in an economic and political down spiral, and the bad politics then precludes the reforms, the impetus for reform that would break them out of that spiral. Now, I want to say that my pessimism about Europe rests on its past, on its present, and the likely future. And that makes me a lot less confident than my fellow panelists that this exercise is going to end too happily. Just in terms of the past, if you just look at Europe's performance in the past, it really is just totally different from what the game was supposed to be. The whole idea of introducing the euro, it was to bring prosperity to the country, to bring greater uniformity in economic performance, to bring political nirvana. That certainly hasn't been the case. Just take a look at the first chart. It's just showing that over the last 8 years, Europe has practically had a lost decade. They're only now recovering, on average, they're only now recovering the level that they were in 2008. If we look at a country like Greece, forget about it. This is a depression that's worse than that in the United States, and Greece is showing little, after 8 years, there's little impetus that Greece is getting out of that situation. But the country that I'm a lot more concerned with is a country like Italy. Italy, some 8 years after the crisis in 2008, is still something like 6 or 7% below its 2008 peak. This, I would say, is a source for great concern. What you're also getting is you're getting a divergence between the performance of the countries in the north, the Germanys of the world, which, as Fred correctly says, is just doing fine, and the countries like Italy and Spain. And what that is doing is it's building really strong tensions between the North and the South. The South doesn't see this project as being in its favor. It might be very good for Germany, but it's certainly not good for the Italians, the Spanish, and the Portuguese, for instance. So we see unemployment levels, very high youth unemployment levels off the chart, if you're looking at places like Italy and Spain. In addition, what you're now seeing, which has to be of concern, particularly after the Brexit vote, is you're seeing declining support for the European project. So, variety of surveys that get taken show that in places like France, Spain, even Germany, something like less than 50% of the population now think that the European idea is such a great idea. So the past isn't too encouraging. One's really got to ask, why is the future going to be very different from this past? They locked in the euro. It limits their ability to adjust policy, and they've still got big imbalances, as I'll mention. Another reason for immediate concern right now is if you look at the European recovery over the past year, this has been a very anemic recovery at best, particularly considering that you had a deep slump. And the reason that it's all the more disappointing is that the tailwinds in Europe couldn't be stronger. They've got a very low interest rates, produced by the ECB buying 80 billion euros of paper a month. They've got a very depreciated exchange rate. The euro's down something like 20% against the dollar. And on top of it, they've got international oil prices that have never been this low, at least for many years. So with all of those tailwinds, they can't produce much recovery. What happens when those tailwinds begin to move to headwinds, when the Fed begins normalizing interest rates? So much for the past. The present that I'm concerned about is that after 8 years of blood, sweat, and toil, with austerity and all the rest, Europe is still left with many of the same kind of imbalances that they've got. So, for a start, if you look at debt levels, Italy, just to single Italy out, that used to have a debt level of about 100% of GDP, is now sitting with a debt level of about 133% of GDP. Same story with a country like Spain. Greece is even worse than that. So the debt level keeps rising. Carlo mentioned, the unit labor costs, that you see the differences between Germany and, once again, a country like Italy. If you look since 2005, Italy's lost something like 15% of international competitiveness to Germany, so that doesn't bode too well for future growth for that country. But Italy is not alone. The same story with Portugal. And then there's this minor problem of the banks, that because they've had such poor economic performance for such a prolonged period of time, if you look at the Italian banks, their non-performing loans are a mere 18% of the Italian bank balance sheets. That's something like a mere 18% of Italian GDP. So you've got really very dysfunctional banking system. So you've got very high levels of debt, no competitiveness, a banking system that is in trouble, and then you've got poor politics. When I look to the future, what my concern is not the Greeces and the Portugals. Greece and Portugal, they're far from out of the woods. Greece and Portugal were small enough for Germany to bail out through the Europeans. My concern looking at the future, my deep concern looking at the future, is that Italy now, in my mind, checks many of the boxes for a crisis. This is only a matter of time before we're going to get a big crisis in Italy. And as I'll explain, Italy is far too big for the Europeans to save. So, for a start, I've mentioned that the Italian economy doesn't grow. This might be a better chart than the previous one. If you look, since 1999, Italy's had about 0.3% of growth a year. So, if you take us, this chart goes back to 2004, we're still below that level. Why is Italy, if Italy couldn't grow before, why is it all of a sudden going to grow now? You've got to assume that Italy doesn't have growth going forward. It's the IMF, incidentally, is forecasting now that Italy will regain its 2008 level of output by 2025. I mean, that really just boggles the mind. 17 years, a country that's over-indebted, got a banking crisis, is at best going to come back to its level in 2025. What happens if Italy gets hit by some sort of shock? As I mentioned, the mountain of debt, Italy is by far the worst of the countries here, just in terms of the non-performing loans, what it is of the bank capital. And to make matters worse, that the Italian banks are holding as much as 10% of their portfolio is government bonds that are likely to have to be restructured. So, it underestimates the bank's banking problem with the non-performing loans. Just before I go on to Italy's too big to save, you've got to just say a word about Italian politics. I wouldn't want to get too involved with this, But Italy's got a referendum coming up in November or beginning of December. The Prime Minister has indicated that he's going to resign if he loses that referendum. All the opposition parties in Italy, contrary to what the other panelists might think, the opposition parties, certainly the Five-Star Party, is saying that they're wanting out of the euro, that the euro is killing them. So irrespective of what some elites in Europe might be thinking, the people on the ground who could very well come into power the next year or two don't want to be in the euro. So I'm not sure that I share the optimism that this thing totally holds together. Just final point, 2 points I'd want to make. The one is that Italy is just far too big to bail out, that Italy has got more than 2 trillion euros of public debt. This is the 3rd largest sovereign bond market in the world. To bail out the Italian public sector is going to be very expensive. When you've also got to be bailing out the Italian public banks, I'm not sure that people in the Alternative for Germany party are going to be jumping up and down at the prospect of Germany, throwing more money at it. I'm told that there's a saying in Germany that says something like an end with a horror is better than a horror without an end. And I think that this is a horror without an end, if you've got to keep repeating bailing out these countries. Last point in just giving a time frame for where all of this might occur is I just point out that the next 12 months are a very crowded calendar electorally. We're going to see a lot of things going on in Europe in terms of elections. We've got the Italian referendum likely to be early December. Spain is likely to have another election to try to get a parliament. This would be the 3rd that is having in a year. You've got elections in France and France and Germany, which could really change the willingness of the people at the center to try to hold this together. So I'm, in short, not that optimistic that this is a long-run proposition.
Thanks, Desmond. Thank you very much to the panel for 4 really interesting, well-informed, and stimulating presentations. I'd like to just go down the panel in the same order we spoke and give people a chance, let's say 3 minutes maximum, to comment on what anybody else said or expand your own thoughts. So Fred, we'll start with you.
Yeah, let me just make 3 comments. I was delighted that Vincent and I were on very much the same wavelength analyzing the German case. I would just add one thought to what he said. His one caveat at the end of his German story was that, yeah, but the Germans have to buy a lot of foreign assets to finance the surplus. Well, of course, any country running a current account surplus has to export an equal amount of capital. And whether they support the Greek pension system or something else, they do have to export capital. Germans do it a lot, as Vincent said, through the Target 2 system that equilibrates the balances within the Eurozone. But that's just an inherent feature of running a big surplus. And my sense is the Germans love the surplus so much that they're willing to do the capital exporting that is required. Sure, they might prefer to buy AAA assets somewhere else than in Greece, but if that's the price, they'll pay it. And I would stick with my comment that they will pay literally any price. Carlo made a very important point when he quoted Mundell as saying Canada was not an optimal currency area. I was reminded that many, many analysts have made the same point about the United States. In fact, as you've probably seen over the years, there have been complex designs that would divide the U.S. up into 5 monetary areas if one really wanted to follow optimal currency area theory. So it's both, as Carlo said, something of a knock on optimal currency area theory, but it's also an indicator that you can create one, as the US has, as Canada has, as a number of other countries have, that wouldn't meet the theoretical construct ex ante. And so I think that kind of adds to the argument that the Europeans who have this driving desire to do it for the reasons I pointed out can do so. Des, in his wrap-up comments, did not disappoint us. He repeated his deep pessimism about the European project. I would simply remind that he and many others also gave very learned, intellectually defensible arguments at the height of the crisis 4 and 5 years ago, demonstrating that it was inconceivable that the euro would not break up at that time. Well, it did not. It has not. I don't think it will. Remember, and this goes to Des's political point, remember, no European country, repeat, no European country has yet voted to get out of the euro. The Greeks had lots of opportunities to do it right at the height of the crisis, and every time it came to a crunch, every poll in Greece, every vote in Greece showed that they wanted to stay in the euro as an overriding objective. They didn't like the austerity, of course, but they wanted to stay in the euro. Now, the Italians might in the future vote against, but I haven't seen it yet. I'm actually doubtful that they would, and so that is to be determined in the future. The underlying economic problem in the Eurozone, Carlo hinted at that, was really the internal devaluation of the Germans. When you look at those unit labor cost numbers over the life of the euro, now 16, 17 years, what they show is that there were really only 2 outliers. Greece was an outlier on the bad side. Germany was an outlier on the, quote, good side. German unit labor costs didn't go up almost at all. Everybody else, even Italy, Spain, were somewhere in the middle. And had it not been for Germany's superior performance and internal devaluation, shows it can be done, the euro crisis and imbalances would never have emerged. So back to Germany, it's got, in that sense, kind of a moral obligation as well as a geopolitical and economic reason to continue to bail out the rest of the region. Des's final question.
Time on you. One more.
Des's final question was, is Italy too big to bail out? Well, he noted in passing that Spain was in the same category. Carlo noted, rightly, Spain is adjusting. Doesn't look like it's going to need to be bailed out. The analogy I would make is with Japan. People have expressed similar anxieties about debt ratios, about internal debt buildups, about lack of competitiveness with Japan for the last 25 years. And as another example of high-level stagnation that I pointed to in my remarks, it has not needed to be bailed out. And I don't think Italy is going to need to be bailed out either. Therefore, I think that Vincent's decision tree does not get activated. I think the European countries themselves, the Eurozone as a whole, will remain resilient. I remain optimistic.
Thank you. That's a good segue to you, Vince.
Thank you. I am delighted that Des views me as an optimist. It doesn't really happen very often, but then compared to Des, a lot of people are optimists. I think my main point is that there is a design flaw in the European project, but there is a puzzle as well. If it is such an inherent design flaw, why did it go on so long? And the answer is that it is very difficult for officialdom to allow failure on their watch. It may come to that if the economics of it no longer justifies enormous German support as they have been giving it. It may happen because of a series of adverse shocks large enough to make it an uneconomic project. However, I think it's always risky to bet against the willingness of bureaucrats to offer opaque and even more complicated solutions. Second, to Fred, I do think Germans love their current account surpluses. I think they love them too much, because the counterpart to that is insufficient fiscal stimulus from the perspective of the European area as a whole. Third, I think we want to step back and remember the big challenge for advanced economies generally. The IMF has marked down their forecast of potential output in 6 out of 7 of the G7 economies over the last 4 years. We have aging populations that are growing more slowly, and for some reason or another, we're not adding that much to output per hour. In an environment where potential output growth is slower, we've essentially tilted down the path of future incomes. That makes households more willing to save because they don't see their wages expanding as fast. It makes firms less willing to invest because that same profile of future income is related to the profile of future earnings. And that will be a test to the debt we've already accumulated, i.e. Carlos' stock issue, because in some sense, that profile of future income provides the wherewithal to have taken on that debt. And it will test the structure of political and economic systems. The concern I have most about the European project generally, but I would expand that to the governments of most advanced economies, is we don't like to explain to our public what we're doing. We prefer opaque, complicated solutions for the fear of an up or down vote. And that does set up potentially an escalating problem.
Votes which turn out to be up or down votes, as you all were suggesting. Carlo.
Well, my bottom, after listening to my fellow panelists, I think that my bottom line remains that there is an issue. There are still imbalances. They can be solved. It's an issue that can be solved. Fred, in a way, is perhaps the most optimistic. As I said, at one point, Fred, you said there is no problem, Europe is doing fine. I think there are just too many differences across Europe. There are just too many divergences that need to be addressed. And I will not rely necessarily entirely on the political arguments, political economy arguments that you used. They are very rational arguments. By those arguments, again, World War II should have never happened, for example. It was not in the best interest of Germany to have World War I. Sorry, not World War I. II is a consequence. World War I should have never have happened. It was not in the best interest of Russia to contribute, to start together with Austria, the First World War. These things happen. They happen because there are people. Even more in democracies than under empires, as at the beginning of last century. And people may be unhappy about how things are going. Yet, I think the solution is possible because it's not an inherent problem like, okay, we are trying to put together economies that inherently are too different. This is a suboptimal currency area. The problems that we have seen derive by wrong policies at the beginning of the last decade. And they could have avoided. They could have been avoided with the right policies. Do we still have time? Desmond says, no, we don't. Italy, in a way, is doomed. Public debt, you said, is likely to be restructured. You should know that Desmond has been saying that public debt in Italy should be restructured for 25 years. And I hope you did not use your savings to bet against the Italian government debt.
At 1%, there's not much downside. Long-term bonds are 1% now.
Okay,
I heard people say that at the beginning of the year about Japan, by the way.
But there is an issue there.
Which is the best performance.
What you did not say is that the deficit in Italy is quite low. This year we should end up at 2.3% of GDP. According to my calculation, it will be enough to freeze. Growth is not very high. It will not be very high over the next 3 or 4 years. Let's say 1%. it would be enough to freeze primary spending in real terms for 4 years to balance the budget, to achieve a balanced budget in Italy. Doesn't seem to be particularly demanding to freeze primary spending in real terms. It does not require cutting public services to anybody. You just need to stop growth, primary spending from growing. So the target of achieving a balanced budget is there. Public debt will remain high for a while. We have just completed a study at the IMF, an econometric study, showing that if the debt to GDP ratio is declining at a certain speed, about 2.5 percentage points per year, the probability of a crisis for a country with high debt is reduced by something like 60%. So the dynamic of the debt to GDP ratio matters. So if Italy manages to freeze primary spending in real terms, then with some growth, real revenues increase, we balance the budget in 3-4 years. If growth is lower, it may take a bit longer. But the solution is there. The debt to GDP ratio will start declining, and this will make things much more sustainable, even if public debt remains high for a long time. So, of course, none of this is easy. None of this is easy. I'm not saying that this will not require an adjustment. Even keeping spending constant in real terms will require an effort, but it's not impossible. Spain, moving to competitiveness, as the chart that you show clearly indicated, has managed to recover competitiveness. Spain is growing by 3%. So there are problems, but there are also solutions.
Thank you. Desmond?
Well, I guess I'd just start by saying Italy hasn't grown for the last 20 years, so I'm not sure that I understand why it should be growing now, particularly when the reformist government looks like it's on its way out. But I guess my key point where I'm a little perplexed is we've just gone through Britain voting to leave the euro, despite the fact that the whole of the political establishment told them to stay within Europe. And nonetheless, the political forces were such that the anti-establishment vote prevailed. I'm suggesting that we've got a political dynamic in Europe that is not at all healthy, both in the sense that in the periphery, we've really got parties who are riding the wave of the anti-austerity fatigue, whereas in Germany, we've got parties beginning to ride the wave of the anti-bailout fatigue. So I think that one's really got to be paying due weight to the political side. Just two other points. One is in terms of what's happened in Europe, I just remind Fred that in the case of Greece, we did have the largest sovereign debt default in history, occurring. It was something like 100 billion euros of Greek debt had to get written off. So the notion that you can get debt written off going forward, I think that should really be a reminder to people holding Italian bonds. And the last thing I'd say is that we're in a world right now where the world is flooded with liquidity. Central banks continue to buy paper at a rapid rate. In those kind of circumstances, generally what happens is you paper over all of the very bad lending decisions that have made before. The question is, what happens when the Fed begins raising interest rates? We'll be in a very different ball game.
Thank you. We're having so much fun up here. I want to give everybody another, say 1 minute, 2 absolute max for further points or rejoinders you want to make, and we'll go down the panel again.
Yeah, just 2 quick points.
Right.
On Brexit, I don't think it'll happen. I think the Brits are going to reverse themselves before it happens, so I don't think we'll see it. But even if it does...
I thought Mrs. May said Brexit was Brexit.
Yeah, right, and hasn't defined it any more than Trump has what it means to make America great again. And so I don't think either of them are going to happen, either Brexit or Trump. But even if Brexit happened, it seems to me it's not much of a precursor of the kind of things Des and others have talked about. Italy, Greece, Portugal, Spain. I mean, The UK has stayed out of the euro. It's not had the euro's problems. It's actually had pretty good economic performance. It's separate issues having to do. Now, you can say, okay, broad terms, sovereignty, Brussels interference, but it seems to me it's a far cry from the kind of problems that you're stressing here with big debt buildups, et cetera. And I don't think it would be an antecedent in any event, but I don't think it'll happen. The other clarification, my ally here, Carlo, quoted me as saying that Europe has no problems. Well, if I said that, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. I thought I, in fact, said that there are a number of things Europe has to do on the institutional front to create the optimal currency area. It's got to move forward towards fiscal harmonization. It's got to do a lot of other things to move toward making the euro a viable project for the longer run. And I would add, which I did not, that a number of the individual European countries certainly have to undertake more structural reforms to get their economies going better. But an underlying cause of everything that Des worries about is the fact that growth potential in Europe is actually very low. It's only 1.5%. When we decry the failure of Europe to grow very much, we have to immediately recall that the growth potential, like here in the US, is not very great. 1.5% is about it. Now, it'd be great to get that higher by getting total factor productivity up, but we know that's very, very difficult. Spain seems to have been doing it. Others can do it, but it pays off over a long time with a lot of effort. But you can't expect much growth, whatever the demand situation, and I certainly agree Germany and others should stimulate more, but you can't get a lot of growth when your supply side potential is only about 1% a year. So we should stop looking for more rapid, more dynamic, more exuberant growth in Europe unless there's a fundamental change in the underlying supply sides of the economy. And again, that's true here in the United States as well. It's just not going to happen. And so we shouldn't look for it, and we shouldn't calculate debt ratios and potential crises at all on a shortfall from something that's just not technically feasible, with or without the Eurozone, with or without the EU.
Thanks. Vince, another point?
Just a couple points. One is a union's a leveling device. Just like I said, because there's a euro, Germany's not Switzerland. Because there's a euro, Italy or Portugal isn't Argentina. Germany has a weaker currency than it would have otherwise. Those economies have lower interest rates than they would have otherwise. It's pulled toward the center, and that provides an enormous economic incentive to keep the project together for all parties involved. But there are tests coming. The tests are importantly demographics, slow potential output growth that do make debt decisions from the past more burdensome. Offset, however, to recognize if your potential output growth is slower, so too is probably the rate of discount to that, i.e. real interest rates are low everywhere and likely will be low everywhere for a while. That means that even though there's challenges coming, there's an opportunity for leaders to lead and design a more resilient system in the European project. But we're here, we got where we are now because of the lack of that leadership, and I do again worry that the inability to provide a coherent narrative on why this is important does make me less confident that those leaders will lead.
Thanks. Carlo, another thought?
Just a couple of things. First of all, one thing that I did not mention in my intervention earlier, we should acknowledge that there was also a spectacular bad luck in terms of what happens, because the euro was created and 8 years later, only 8 years later, there was a major worldwide crisis, not caused by Europe, but by the US since the 30s. So unfortunately, there was quite a lot of bad luck. Let's hope it does not happen again. Second, again on Italy, I forgot to mention something that is important about what Desmond said, the very high level of non-performing loans. It is true, it is a concern. The figures are not as bad as the headline figures would show. The non-performing loans to GDP ratio is 18%, but the bad loans, the weakest part is 12%. It's about 200 billion. Of this, 120 billion have already been provisioned. They've already been set aside. They've already contributed to low profitability. So profitability has been low because a large amount of this money, of these bad loans, have been provisioned already. So the part that is not yet provisioned is about 80 billion, and against this there are real and personal guarantees amount to 120 billion. So the issue is there. I'm not saying that there's no issue, but it's not as bad as it would look by just looking at the headline figures.
Desmond?
Yeah, I'm glad I can agree with Fred on a point, and that is that growth potential in Europe is very poor, so you're not going to get much growth out of Europe. But I would have thought that that would make Fred concerned. How is Europe possibly going to grow out of its public debt problem, and how's it going to grow out of its banking sector difficulties? These are a lot easier to deal with in rapidly growing economies, as the Chinese show us. But if you've got a very stagnant economy and you've got very high debt levels, then you're really vulnerable to any external shock. And just on the question of the potential of countries to vote to want to get out of the euro, I think once again, just take a look at Italy. You've got the Five-Star Party now that is polling at the same rate as the governing party. They, together with the other opposition parties, are saying they're wanting out of the euro, that the euro has been killing Italy. The point that they're seeing, and I share that view, is it's very difficult. Carlo is saying that for Italy to deal with its public debt problem, all it's got to do is have a little bit of growth. Well, that's a lot easier said than done, if you've got to engage in fiscal austerity to meet those programs. I just don't see where you get the growth from.
Thank you all very much. I think we started off talking about the original political rationale for the United States of Europe. And then Vince brought up, you have two possible rationales, an economic one. We've talked a lot about both and their interaction. If the economic rationale doesn't seem to be working as well as hoped, I think we can conclude there's no guarantee that the political rationale holds as generations change and the new generations of leaders it's clearly easy to imagine, at least, new generations of leaders arising without the old political commitment. I kept sitting here thinking if we were having this panel in 1850 and our topic were
the euro was created in 1999.
1850. Can the United States of America project survive? It wouldn't have at all been clear because of politics that it could have. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to come to your questions. Let me remind you, we will have microphones. Please wait for the microphone before you say anything. Then tell us your name and affiliation and your question. Any questions which are preceded by too long a lecture will be reminded by the chair that it will be time to come to the question. I have some hands. We're going to start with you, and then we'll come over and get you, and then we'll keep working around here. Yes, please.
Thank you. Great panel. Hilda Ochoa, Strategic Investment Group. Question is, the tragic beauty of the aging of the developed countries' population is that in a way it's a problem that will solve itself in 10 to 15 years, and progressively so, they will all be dead. So the question is, has anyone gotten past that? Because that problem will begin to be solved in 8 to 10 years. So it's an honest question. Have you all looked into the demographics and the curves? And there was clearly a boom in the 1940s. That is what's aging right now and creating growth problems and asymmetries between savings and investments and allowing low interest rates.
Okay, thanks. How about the demographics, the aging of societies, Europe in particular, which has this problem very heavily? Anybody want to take this?
Yeah, no, the aging of societies exacerbates problems rather than solves it, because what it means is that you've got fewer young people to support more old people. And in many of these countries, what it means is people are running down their savings. So these people, if you've got a government that's still got a large deficit and you've got the population aging and they're using their savings, that makes it difficult for the government to finance their deficit. So I think that the aging of the populations is a greater problem. It really makes it difficult for these economies to grow rapidly. It reduces their saving levels. It makes it very difficult to deal with their public finances. It increases the odds that they're going to have to restructure their debt.
Okay, Carlo.
Okay, now just let me then bring some good news about Italy, because how serious the problem of aging is in terms of the pension system depends on whether you have already reformed or not the pension system. In 2012, Italy reformed its pension system. As a result, the IMF indicates that the pension debt of Italy's pension debt, defined as the net present value of the increase in pension spending over the next 50 years, is zero. For the US, I think it's about, US and Germany, I think it's about 35 for the US and 40% for Germany. The same applies to the health system. The net projected by IMF, the net present value of pensions, of healthcare spending increases for the US, I think is of the order of 100%. For Italy, is of the order of 20%. So how much this problem of aging is relevant depends on whether you have reformed your pension system or not, your healthcare system or not. So that needs to be taken into account. France also has recently reformed its pension system, and the IMF has revised down its projection of France's pension debt to about zero. Finland is in a bad shape, for example, so one needs to take these things into account.
Actually, this is one of those areas where Japan, once again, is the leading example of macro distress, in that it is a population that's declining outright, aging rapidly with no safety valve of immigration. You know that in a government with 250% of gross debt and a dependency ratio that is so high, where the young have to support the old, is not sustainable. If you walk that forward, I think the answer there, and the answer to come generally, is you got to confiscate some of the wealth of the elderly. And the way you do that is either cutting back benefits and/or unexpected inflation.
And negative interest rates. Yeah. We could talk about this a long time. It was a good question. Thank you very much. I'm going to come to this question here, please, and then I'm going to come back here. Yes. Go ahead.
Thank you. My question was related to demographics, so I'll pass.
Okay, thanks. We're right back at this table here. It's coming. The microphone is coming.
Here we go, Ann.
Thank you. Ann Krieger from SICE. I'm struck by the elephant in the room that was not mentioned by anybody, which of course is migration.
Thank you, Ann. That's a question, I think. How about migration? I guess we mentioned it in terms of the political stresses which go against the political, psychological desire for European Union. But how about migration, and can the European project survive?
Well, it's if it continues at anything like the normal pace, aside from recent upsurge, it's of course a partial answer to the growth problem. It does provide one source of labor supply expansion to alleviate the supply side limitations that I emphasized. As Vincent just said, Japan does not avail itself of that option. So in that sense, Europe has a better prospect than Japan. I would think the Europeans have already demonstrated some considerable resilience. They've been able to cut back on the huge surge, probably more than they can sustain. But I don't think that one's going to break the back of the European project. obviously the ultimate answer is peace in the Middle East.
Desmond?
Yeah.
That one may take a while, still.
I didn't mention immigration out of omission. You know, it was a question that I wanted to be optimistic. The reason immigration, I think, is really very important is that this is one of the factors that is now driving the Alternative for Germany party. And I think it's really very important what Angela Merkel's position is. You know, you'll recall last year, you know, during that Greek crisis, the Minister of Finance of Germany, Wolfgang Schäuble, wanted Greece to leave, and it was Angela Merkel who held Greece together. I think that if her position is weakened and we get a crisis in Europe, it's really going to be very difficult to orchestrate the kind of bailouts that we've had in the past. So I think this immigration, I would see this immigration as being very dangerous from Merkel's point of view. It's very clear that this is considerably weakening her position, both within her coalition and from the opposition, which limits her room for maneuver in dealing with Europe's problems.
Thank you. Any questions over on this side? Yeah, right here, please.
David Cheney is my name. In the likelihood or in the event of a failure of the euro, what scenario do you see?
You know, breakup of the currency,
Yes.
of the currency of the Eurozone. Well, Vince, maybe you'd like to take that since you were running the scenarios for the failure of the European Union and the euro.
I think what's the most plausible scenario? At some point, a government is going to have to make a choice between its sovereign national financial champion and continued ongoing support to other sovereigns, i.e., if Germany were confronted with a banking crisis, then its willingness to continue with the project would be challenged. More than any, fully appreciate that there are enormous benefits to being in the euro area for Germany in terms of the subsidy to its manufacturers, but at some point it may ask the question whether a littler euro area of more like-minded governments would be appropriate than having those continuing transfers.
How little?
The problem is the
your
smaller
guess?
you make it, the less you get, less depreciated a currency you have because you're joining together countries with similar attitudes toward inflation and debt. So I think that's the calculation. It's it'll be banking versus sovereign support.
I would just comment on that. Germany actually has had two episodes of what I would think of as at least modest banking crises. When the specter of Greek exit and default, as Des said, was looming, that had a big potential effect on the German banks, who were hugely exposed to Greece. So when Germany responded to Greece as they did, it was, of course, with the position the German banks in mind, but that was another reason why they would pay anything necessary and did so, and they got over that. More structurally, the Landesbanken in Germany have for a long time been poor performers, subsidized by the government. That hasn't been totally resolved, but again, under the somewhat lash of the Commission, there has been criticism of the state aids that those banks have gotten and some reforms that have been foisted upon them, which the German government's carried out. So I think we've had at least a couple of partial examples which Germany and the Eurozone as a whole overcame, which would add to my sense of resilience and ability to cope, particularly in crisis situations that the Eurozone and EU more broadly have demonstrated.
I would point out the emphasis on the words modest, partial, and the counterparty being as small as Greece.
Yeah, it's not,
I mean that's the risk.
yeah, that's fair.
Okay, thank you. We're going to come this one, and then I'll get you next. Here. There we are. Thank you.
Hi. I'm Robert Donachie. I'm a finance and economics reporter. Do you think Great Britain will see long-term growth that they would otherwise not have had they remained in the EU?
Okay, how about Great Britain after Brexit? Is it better or not? Anybody?
No, I would say it's not better. The real question is how much worse is it going to be? And that's going to depend on the terms they negotiate with the EU and whatever substitute arrangements they can make with other trading partners like the United States. At a minimum, that's a long-term process fraught with huge uncertainty, which is why I predict it's not going to happen. And so in the meanwhile, there'll still be a lot of uncertainty, which will dampen investment in the UK, European and British growth, somewhat offset by the weaker exchange rate. I mean, you could sort of accuse the Brits of competitive devaluation if you wanted to be really sort of savage about this and say, well, this was a very clever way to get the exchange rate down and give a little boost to their manufacturing. But I don't think on balance that's going to hold. So I think it's all downside. The only question is how much. I think it'll be enough that they'll recognize it and reverse course before it becomes irreversible.
UK voters voted to leave. They didn't tell us where they were going to leave to. And so what it all depends on is 3 tracks of negotiation. The UK with Europe, the UK with the rest of the world, and the UK negotiating with itself how to legislate everything that they now get from regulations associated with the EU. So you're talking about a window of 2 years for the EU relationship, 5 years or more for the relationship with the rest of the world to be settled, and then 10 years for them to legislate everything they need to do. That's a lot of uncertainty. By having created that uncertainty, they basically inflicted an aggregate demand shock on themselves. And the depreciation of the pound, the reduction in gilt yields, was a way of sharing that loss with the rest of the world. I do suspect they actually overshared in the sense that for those economies stuck at the zero lower bound, the effective lower bound, the euro area and Japan actually saw higher real interest rates as a result of that disinflationary impulse. Could the UK wind up better as a result? It's possible. Will we know? Come back in 10 years.
And we'll see if Europe as a union is still there at the same time. Carlo, on this question, then we're going to go to the next question.
Yeah, on the estimate made by the IMF staff is that over the medium term, the UK will lose about 4.5% of GDP as a result of the exit from the European Union. This estimate is plus some uncertainty, some loss of GDP in the relatively shorter run due to these uncertainty effects. The medium-term, longer-term impact was estimated based on how much would be the loss of trade of the UK vis-à-vis the rest of the world. The UK will lose vis-à-vis Europe, it may gain vis-à-vis the rest of the world. On balance, the IMF staff thought that there would be a loss. It really depends a lot on the new trade deals that the UK will strike over the next several years, so we'll see.
Thank you. Up here, please, next. Wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Teresa Terminacian, formerly from the IMF. I have a question. Some argue that Europe is currently suffering from a lack of demand, and that a major sort of infrastructure investment boost would help get over this sort of very bad period and really provide a sustained stimulus to growth. I would be curious to hear the panel's view on this.
All right, how about infrastructure for Europe? Anybody, Carlo?
I guess that no. I know that Teresa very well. She knows we agree on this issue. I think that there is a demand issue. There is a demand issue in Italy, in Europe, partly in the rest of the advanced country world. Otherwise, inflation would not be so low. I mean, clearly, there is lower growth when inflation is so low, that hints you at the fact that there is a demand issue. I think that individual countries have much less room to address through fiscal policy this demand issue. At the European level, if there were a federal budget, if there were infrastructural spending financed by a federal budget, it would help. This said, for me, the much more severe problem relates to structural reform. I mean, aggregate demand is weak, there is a need to close the output gap, but I'm much more concerned about the longer term, the medium term growth prospect, which depends on structural reform.
Desmond?
Yeah, I can see the argument, that you would want to have some sort of fiscal boost, but the trouble is that many of the countries in the euro are constrained, that their public finances, certainly the periphery, that they can't do it. The country that could do it, would be Germany, that is very reluctant. Germany's got the fiscal space to do it. And just on Germany, that I think that there's a problem globally is that Germany is now running the largest current account surplus of any country on earth, both in absolute terms and in terms of GDP. It's running a current account surplus of something like 8.5% of GDP. So, there would be a very strong case from a global point of view for Germany to engage in fiscal stimulus and to leave the euro. It would be doing everybody a favor.
I have a question here. Yes? Up here, please, then we'll come back and get you. And that will be it, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. Michael Kurtzig, retired from the Department of Agriculture. You began the discussion about the expansion of the EU and whether it's overexpanded. And so the question is, years ago I could name the few members. Now I don't think it's possible. What is the implication for Turkey? Does that mean Turkey is out? It's not going to expand anymore, particularly with the situation with refugees and so on? Thank you.
Good question. What is the very large number, soon to be 27, I guess, of EU members mean for Turkey? Anybody?
Turkey.
Fred?
Well, Turkey's prospects have not been good previously. They tried to negotiate a deal around the refugee crisis. That seems to be collapsing. So I would not count very soon on Turkish membership in the EU. I do think the broader points you make about the expansion of the community, I assume that part of the reason for Desmond's charts showing this dispersion rather than convergence within the EU membership over the last 20 years or so is because of that increased membership. You've now got a different universe of countries. If you looked at the original 6 or even 9 or 12, I don't know if the same result would occur. So just as one ex post at least can criticize letting Greece into the euro, one can criticize the degree to which the community expanded. That, of course, went back to the original political rationale and reinforced the obligation on the people that need to hold it together to do so. I mean, they did let more people in. That did raise additional problems, which makes it harder, but also adds to the case for keeping it together, or else you shut yourself in the foot. And again, then they'd have to admit to having made some big errors, which they wouldn't want to do.
I mean,
This is going
can we just
to
say
go ahead, and then we're going to take our last question back here.
I don't know the answer to the question, will the European project fail, but I do pretty sure that the European project's momentum has stopped.
Yeah. Thank you. Last question back here.
That's an interesting question, whether some of these Mediterranean countries will still...
Scott Klumpner, Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Perhaps it was so obvious that nobody took time to define success or failure. I assume that there's some nuance in the number of countries that have to leave before anyone will admit failure. But on the other side, is it fair to call success keeping the institutions intact, the membership intact, if the best you can do is kind of this unending horror of the dynamic equilibrium of bailouts and not really achieving the goals of the single currency in the first place?
Okay, good question as an ending one. What would be failure and what would be success?
I think that
is one country leaving the euro failure?
Yeah, I think that is a fair question. And certainly it was front and center at the time of the Greek crisis when a lot of people, myself included, said, well, if they got rid of Greece, though I predicted they would not, but I said if they did get rid of Greece, it would help them. It would make the project stronger over time by getting rid of the weakest sister. Likewise, I think you can argue that Brexit, if it does happen, will strengthen the European Union because the UK has always been a drag on any effort to further the integration process. So it's true, you lose a major member and that's got cost. On the other hand, to the extent you can get forward momentum again and try to build the kind of institutional progress that I was suggesting, that should happen, I think will happen, but certainly have to do it. Having Britain out would actually make that easier. So it's a very complicated question, and I think we probably could all agree that neither the euro nor the EU is going to break up in the sense that the members will have a summit someday and announce the dissolution of the Rome Treaty and the whole thing disappears. So what would be the critical mass that would be lost? I mean, that's an interesting question. We probably all ought to do more research on that.
Desmond, as the originator of this highly interesting conference, we're going to give you the last word. Well, hang on. Before Desmond's last word, we'll give Carlo a last word.
Okay. No, I agree with Fred. I don't think that Brexit in itself could be defined as a failure of the European project as a whole. Things would be very different if there were a major breakup of the euro area. I don't see the current European project survive if the euro area project, if the euro project also does not survive. Certainly, it would be a very different European Union with a very different time horizon to achieve what, from the beginning, in a way, has been the real motivation, to achieve at one point in the future a political union. If there is a step back on the euro area, that I would regard it as a major failure.
That would be consistent with my thought that currency and sovereignty are clearly highly linked, and Vince's position that the ECB is actually the government of Europe.
I said that. I said that. Don't tag him with that.
I thought he said. Did you say that?
I said
good. All right, there we go. We agree on that one too.
Yep.
Desmond, you're getting, as I said, as the originator of the whole thing,
okay.
You get the last word on failure.
The last word I'd say is that the euro was the greatest mistake that Europe made, that adopting the euro really put them on the path where they are. So for me, what success would be is if they somehow could unwind the euro, maybe have a country like Germany leave the euro, which would make that possible, but maintain the single market, which is a good part of Europe. Get rid of the bad, save the good. If they stick with the euro, they're just dooming themselves to another decade of lousy economic performance, and they'll blow up politically.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us, and let's appreciate our panel's great contributions.
I don't necessarily agree on this. That it